Is your small Honda not getting a spark to the spark plug? Let's look into see what could be causing that. If you find that your small Honda engine isn't getting fire to your spark plug, there's several things it could be. I mean, your spark plug could be bad, so you want to, when you start testing this, you could take out the spark plug and use a screwdriver to just hold it to a little bit to the ground to test it. But if you're sure your spark plug's good, then it comes back to possibly like spark plug wire. That's always a possibility, but usually they just don't up and go bad. Your ignition coil, that's the thing that the wire runs from it to the spark plug. Because there's several coils on these bikes, but we're going to talk about that here in a second. You have an ignition coil, that's the one that the spark plug wire runs to the spark plug. That can go bad and they just up and go out. And it could be that. But there's ways of testing that. If you see where some of these bikes, the coils are hard to find. CT70s are buried around and underneath the gas tank when you raise the seat. XL70s, SL70s, or 90s, any of those types would have gas tanks. Usually the coil's up in between the tank, and the only way to really get to those is pull the tank off. So in this video I don't actually show how I got to the coil or testing it, but what I did do to eliminate the coil was there's only one wire that comes off the coil. So what I did was just add 6 volts to it and just tapped it and watched the spark plug spark, and it fired. So that told me the ignition coil's good. Your spark plug ignition coil looks something like this, and it can be tested off the bike. And if so, then just follow the voltage settings I have set here. You would take where your mounting holes go, and that would be your ground attached to the negative side of the battery or whatever your power source is, and then just tap the single wire there and with the spark plug in the spark plug wire, and watch and see if it'll spark. Of course, it has to be grounded. The spark plug does. I mean, it has to be grounded the same as the mounting holes for the coil. But with the spark plug base grounded where the threads are and the mounting holes in the coil, then just add 6 volts, tap it to that wire, and see if the spark plug fires. Although more than likely you're going to be testing the coil on the bike, so it'll already be mounted. All you've got to do is just take 6 volts from the bike, either from the battery or use an outside power source, but you'll have to ground to the chassis of the bike. Just tap that wire with the spark plug in the spark plug cable, and with the spark plug grounded, of course, and see if it'll spark. And if it does, then this coil is good. This testing procedure eliminates the ignition spark plug coil and the spark plug wire. So that led it back down to the stator, or the magneto, where there's a flywheel. And in behind that flywheel there's some points and a condenser, and there's 2 coils. Well, there's going to be at least 1 coil. If you have a lighting system like a headlight and you have a battery, then you're going to have 2 coils. But if you just have like an XR75, which is still the same thing, different style engine but still the same breaker plate and stuff, it only has 1 coil just to fire the ignition. And there's a multitude of tests on these. You can measure the resistance from one wire to the other in these coils, or from the base to ground to the wire of the coil coming off the coil, and they measure like 1 ohm. But before you get into measuring the coils, you want to look at your points. If you turn the flywheel, there's little openings in it. You can see if the points are opening and closing. If they're not opening and closing, your points have closed up and it's not going to fire. So the first thing you want to do is inspect your points, make sure they're not burnt, because they got 2 contact points. And if they get burnt, it won't actually make connection. So look at that. It can't have any kind of debris in there. If it does, it's not connecting. But if it looks fine, then get you a feeler gauge. On most small Hondas, 14 thousandths is what the gap is supposed to be. And I'll show you in the video how you line up the flywheel, look at the little window, and adjust the points. But if that's opening and closing correctly, you're still not getting fire, then we're going to need to take the flywheel off. And then also, once we get the flywheel off, we're going to look at the coil. And there's a condenser down there, and usually when you lose fire, it's the condenser. In this case, this particular motorcycle is the CT70 that I was working on. The customer,
he'd already tried to change out the points in the condenser, and where he ran it, where he fell out, which wasn't really his fault. You have to have at least a 140 watt soldering gun. I mean, I've got a 100 watt and I've tried to use it, and you sit there and hold it forever. But if you got you a good, at least 120, 140 watt soldering iron, and you can pop there, you can get that middle part of that condenser hot enough to melt a little solder onto them and then solder to it. There's two little leads that stick up that look like leads, but what those are wire restraints. So once you solder the wire to the condenser, you bend those over just to basically help hold the wire to keep it in place. They're not to be soldered to, they're just actually wire restraints. So let's look at this video, dive into it, and see what you think. And you can, if you got any questions, be sure to ask me here at the end of the video.
Now this is a 1970 CT70 that's not getting fired to the spark plug.
Now, I've already done a few tests and stuff, one using voltage to the actual ignition coil, the spark plug coil, and tapping it to ground and the spark plug fires, so that tells me that ignition coil is working. But you have coils, or at least a coil, there's two in here, one's for lighting, but the one we're really concerned with is the ignition coil for the magneto. If it's not producing the voltage or being triggered correctly, then it won't fire the other coil. When it comes to ignition systems on these smaller bikes, they don't require the battery to give it the voltage for the coil. If you're like in a car, the battery actually energizes the ignition coil. Let's talk about older ignition systems. The newer ones are all different, but if you have an older car with a coil and a set of points and a distributor and stuff, the way that works is no battery. Even if you could figure a way to crank it, if you don't have any battery voltage on the coil, it can't energize to be able to give it a spark. On a motorcycle, it works different. It doesn't require a battery. When that magneto turns, when you crank it, it generates the electricity to fire the spark plug coil. So in this case, I've tested it at the plug-in right there coming off the magneto, and I'm not getting any voltage at all. So behind that is your ignition coil, or magneto coil for the ignition. Then you have a set of points and a condenser. So you've only got I mean, that magnet's fixed in that magneto there, so it's still, you can stick a screwdriver to it and it sticks right to it, so the magnet hasn't lost its stuff. So it's either going to be the magneto coil for the ignition that's bad, the set of points, which I've checked and they're working fine, or the condenser, which is usually the most common thing to go wrong. Now, this was installed by a friend of mine, and we've worked on these things for years, and quite often the condenser, you have to get the center of it just to like molten lava temperatures to actually melt to get to the wires to actually solder to it. Don't know why they did it that way. You'd think they would have put a screw connector or something on it, but so we've often had to go back and resolder them several times. But I'm going to step you through my diagnostic steps here to show you what I was looking at to see what's working and what's not.
To check or adjust the points, you would use this window in the flywheel. Turn the flywheel till you see the T line up with the little notch in the crankcase, and that actually gives you the correct point, or the points will be the most widest. Back this screw off right here just a little bit. You still need it to be snug. In this slot right here, you use a flat blade screwdriver, and you can see, and you just put it straight in. And all this is done with the flywheel on, and you're working through straight to this window, but I wanted to show you this exploded view, or this opening view, so you can understand. But you put the screwdriver blade straight in there, twisting clockwise opens the points gap, and turning it counterclockwise closes up the points gap.
Okay, if you're working on an XL7 or a CT or XL, if you're working on an old Honda, this is pretty much your standard plugs. Now, what I've done here, you have on the CT, it doesn't have a neutral light up on the speedometer or anywhere on it, so it doesn't have to have that wire. But the green and the yellow is for your lighting system. In other words, it supplies the power to charge the battery and to run the lights. The black wire is your ignition. That's the one that actually sends the pulsed voltage signal. Now, you got to realize that these magnetos on these things produce AC current, not DC. It has a rectifier that converts it to DC. I've already tested the ignition. It's not producing anything, but I wanted to show you. I wanted to hook onto the lighting. You just ground it anywhere to the chassis. Set your voltmeter to AC. Alright, so now I'm going to set it on 7 meter to where it would it'll read the max and hold it. That way you don't sit there and try to guess it. I don't know why it's giving me a 20.24 volts, but so just from a crank, it gave me 5 volts right off just from just an easy crank. So the ignition coil should be doing the same thing. It should be providing a volt, anywhere from 2 or 3 volts to 6 volts when just from a crank, and pulsing it. I'm going to switch it over to the ignition wire, which is the black wire on my Hondas. It's not producing any voltage. And like I said, if I switch back over to a lighting coil, to the other coil that's on that magneto, let's get it off that. So the harder crank, I got 6.39 volts. And this is off the lighting coil. So the coil is producing great on that one. You can see the ignition coil doesn't produce any voltage at all. But that could be the condenser. I know the points work, so it's probably the condenser. We've got a connectivity problem. However, it could be the coil, but we'll dig into it. Now I've unsoldered the wires, and it looked like that a couple of wires really weren't connected very well. I have no idea why they designed this condenser this way. I mean, you have to get that solder exactly right or it just won't make connection. Even when it's soldered, it's not connecting. You have to get it to the right spot, the right temperature to get it to connect. So I'm going to do some testing. According to the book, I don't have a microfarad or a capacitor tester, but according to the book, it should read no less than 0.5 ohms between the casing and the center of that condenser. That's a condenser. So I'm going to test it, like I said, to see if I've got a 0.5 ohm between the center and the casing. I've got to charge it with 6 volts. Well, I don't have to, but I'm going to charge it with 6 volts. Because if I can't get the ohmage reading correct, then I'm going to charge it with 6 volts and short the center to the casing and see if I get a spark. If I do, then the condenser's good. I'm also going to test that coil, that yellow wire right there. I'm going to jump over to the pigtail and just connect the 2 wires and put the flywheel back on and crank it and see if I get my 4 to 6 volts out of it. And if I do, then we know the magneto coil is good, and it's got to be the condenser. That's the only thing left in there to do this. So either the condenser's bad, or it's just, you know, like I said, getting this solder connection seems to be a booger on these for some reason. Okay. Not sure if we can see that in there, but touch the center of the condenser. Very in there. Nothing. So let's change the range. Get any ohmage reading in it, so it's possibly a problem. I will say never go just by one measurement. Don't say, okay, it didn't work, so it's bad. Because I have seen where they tell you specs, you try them, it doesn't work. But you try something else, and it does. So I'm going to go ahead and get out my 6-volt battery charger and charge it up. Because basically it's like a battery. I'm going to charge it like a battery and then see if it shorts. And if it does, it's good. If it doesn't, then we got a bad capacitor. Okay, I made sure this wire right here is the one that comes up here on this pigtail, this black one here. This is the wire that goes to the magneto ignition coil. This coil here is what actually generates electricity to the coil that fires the spark plug. This is the wire to it. So I just tacked them together with solder, put the flywheel back on, just kick started, tested the voltage, and I got right at 10 volts off this one coil here. So that's telling me that it's producing plenty of juice, so it should work. So the issue would be the condenser, because the points work. I checked them, I adjusted them to 14 thousandths. They're opening, closing fine, test the continuity, off and on works. We know the coil is generating the power, so the only thing left is the condenser. So, okay, before we start testing for ohmage, this is the one that came out of it. And this is the new one. I just now took it out of the bag. It's a Honda brand, right out of the Honda bag. I've already done all my testing, so I know exactly what to expect. So to discharge the capacitor for testing for ohmage, connect your lead, or connect the lead to the casing, and just connect the lead to the center post, and just let it sit there for a minute. And what this is doing is shorting it and discharging it. And while it's doing that, set your multimeter for mega ohms. And what the other one did is it basically, once I touched the leads, it just basically discharged the ohmage like this. It's hard to read the max of it, but now it's dead. It discharged, testing for mega ohms, because now I won't do it again until I short it out again. So the ohmage, in my opinion, tested fine. Now let's test it for voltage. I'll go charge it up. In order to charge this capacitor, you can hook to a 6-volt battery charger, or 6-volt, the battery that comes in the motorcycle, or even a lantern battery, as long as you're providing 6 volts DC. So you want to run the negative side of your battery charger to the case, which the case is ground. Then run the positive side of your battery source. Just touch the center and hold it for about 3 or 4 seconds. And then it's charged. And that's it. Now the book calls for charging it and then taking your leads and going to the case to the center, and you'll see a spark. I tried on the new one, it doesn't work. So let's just use a little more science to it and use the multimeter to test for voltage. Can't even talk this morning. So anyways, now I'm going to test it for voltage. It was up to almost 9 volts, and it's discharging through the multimeter, and you see it growing down. So in my opinion, this capacitor is good. I think the problem was my friend soldered it to these leads, which is really kind of smart because it keeps the heat off the center. Unfortunately, and I've tried that before in the past too, and it didn't work. You have to solder right here in dead center of this guy, and I don't know why they did that. You'd think they would have made it with a stud where you just screw onto it or something, but nonetheless, you'll have to solder to it, which I don't like because it heats it up. But it seems to work when I've done them. They last that way. But that's the next step. Just put a solder connection on that, and then solder the wires to it. And that takes about 120 watt soldering iron. I've already tinned it, but what I did is I held this to the center until I got that center hot enough, and I didn't stick the solder to the soldering iron. I stuck it to the button until it started filling with solder, and that's what you call tinning it and prepping it. Now the solder's on the top, and it'll be easier to connect your wires to it. So that's the first prep. So now we've got it, and it doesn't hurt. Once it's cool, we can test it again just to make sure that we didn't burn it up. But every one of these I've done, this is how you have to do them. You have to heat that top up, get that solder melted, and then to tin it, and then your wires, you just solder them into it. It's a lot far easier. And then the restraints you just push over on top of the wires. You don't.
Now all I'm doing here is just actually melting the solder that I put on earlier, and I tinned that wire, and all I did was heat it up and just put a dash of solder on it, but it already had some anyhow. But just heating up the center, then putting my wire into it, and now that wire's soldered. And I'm going to bend the restraint over to keep that wire in place because I have the other wire to solder into it, and I don't want it to release when I do the soldering on it. Even though I said you don't solder those wire restraints to the wires, what I do is once I bend them over, I get them hot and I kind of melt the solder to them. That way it kind of holds them down. That keeps them from ever popping up and getting into the flywheel. Plus it doesn't hurt to to add a little more solder to the two wires that I've actually just soldered to the connection.
Upon editing this video, I noticed that I didn't show how to take the flywheel off. You can beat it with a, I don't mean beat it, you can tap on it with a brass hammer. And if not, the best way to do it is use a puller. And they look similar to this. And what I'll do is I'll put it down in the description, but it's kind of screws in, there's some threads, and you'll notice that there's some threads bigger around than the nut in the center of that flywheel. And it's reverse threads, so you just screw it in counterclockwise, and then the center screw is regular, and it just pushes on the flywheel and pops it off. They're not hard to come off. So, but if you've got a good solid rubber mallet, or you can use a brass hammer, that's what this is, it's made out of brass. You can just tap it around the corners and on the side and just kind of wiggle and pull when you're tapping it. Don't beat it hard. And don't beat the center of the shaft either. If you mess up those threads, you're going to have to chase the threads, and it can damage the crank. So just tap on it lightly, or like I said, use a puller. So I hope this helps you on the understanding of how to test a coil. In this case, in this video here, I bypassed the condenser and the points and stuff and just ran the coil wire straight out, put the flywheel back on, cranked it, and measured the voltage, and I was getting, I think, like 9 volts. I've done a few of them here recently, but they're like, you should at least get 6 volts coming out of it. And if you got 6 volts coming out, then your coil's good. So then I knew, and I knew the points were working because I tested the contacts off and on. So it came back down to the condenser. So, like I said, sometimes electronics, or, electrical things on cars and motorcycles can be confusing to some people. So if you have any questions, be sure to leave me some comments. So if you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe, and always check back because I'm always working on something crazy. Thanks for watching.